Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how do you do surface mount soldering. And this is going to be relevant to your Megasat board, but before you start on that, we want to teach you how to do surface mount soldering using this practice board that you should have received in the mail. And so you should have got the practice board as well as a bunch of different components that came with it. So, and some of the components are on the back too, by the way. So I haven't removed that yet. So the first thing I want to do is talk about my area and the setup and the different tools that we'll be using today. So the first thing is I want you to notice that my area is pretty clean. Maybe it's not perfectly clean, but it's pretty good. And I definitely, whenever doing surface mount soldering, like to keep the area clear because I don't want to accidentally pick up any components or extra metal pieces or anything and then put them on the board as we're doing it. These parts are very fine pitch, and so it's very easy to accidentally get a metal piece across some pins, as well as just any dirt or anything that could cause the pins to bridge across each other. So definitely keep it clean. And then I'm wearing my just regular glasses, but I highly recommend that you also use safety glasses whenever you're soldering. I think regular glasses are probably okay as well. And so the setup, I've got a soldering iron. It's set to 675 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the soldering iron itself, as well as there's a sponge here, a copper braid, and a vise, some solder, and a pair of tweezers, as well as a brush and some alcohol. So just to kind of go in a little bit more details about some of this, one thing to note is the soldering iron tip. There are different tips that you can get for your soldering iron, and you might just be using some generic one that you have in the lab, and it's okay as long as it's not super thick on the end. If it's a larger diameter, then basically you will have problems whenever you're trying to solder these individual pads because you're going to touch over multiple pads. So you might have something in your lab that might be a little bit smaller, but just check on that just in case. And then I also have the sponge here. So I went to the faucet over here and I ran water over it, and so it's pretty moist, and you definitely want to get it moist enough that you can, it's moist throughout the entire time that you're going to be soldering. And then the other thing I have is the copper braid, as there's a different one here, and you don't need the copper braid if you don't have one. Just make sure that you have a sponge because you can pretty much find a sponge anywhere, but the copper braid is nice. And so throughout, just remember that every few pads that I solder, I then go out and I'm going to be cleaning this. And the way I clean it is I run this through the sponge as well as running it through the copper wire. And this will then basically, whenever you look down on it, it should be nice and clean. There shouldn't be any black crud or anything like that that you're going to then solder onto your board. There's also, sometimes you might see components like this if you happen to have a setup. This is also often used for surface mount soldering, where you can kind of put the two tips on two different areas, but it's definitely not something that you need in order to do any of the soldering that we're going to be doing today. The next thing to note is the actual solder itself. So just like the soldering iron tip, there are there's a lot of different varieties in solder and the diameter that you can get with it. So if you happen to take a look and you see something that's a little bit thinner, find the thinnest one that you have. But typically for what we're working with, the standard diameters that you might find will be adequate. Also have is a pair of tweezers. So this is a pair of metal tweezers. It doesn't necessarily need to be bent in this way, but you will need like a fine pair of tweezers, metal tweezers that you can hold components down with. Another thing that I use is the wick, and so this is used to remove extra solder that might have ended up on the board. And then I also have a brush, as well as the isopropanol alcohol, and this is what I use whenever I'm finished with the board to clean it. And then the brush, you know, this is sort of a plastic brush. If you have an unused toothbrush, that works as well. And then whenever you spray it, and then brush, you want to definitely just let it dry, like air dry. Don't try to take any napkins or Kim wipes or anything that could leave fibers to clean it. You just kind of let it dry naturally, and that's pretty much it. All right, and then the last important part is the vise right here. So this is what I use to hold the board. I would highly recommend if you can find this in your lab. It's very, very helpful. And if you can't find it, you know, it might be sort of intuitive to try to solder directly on your bench and just kind of hold it over it. But I would say that, you know, you can definitely accidentally damage the board. You can have components that get damaged, or you can just pick up extra trash that's, you know, on your bench. So you might even look for like a cardboard box that you could place it on, and then maybe you can get some painter's tape or something and then tape one side of the board down, and that way you would still be able to solder the other end of it and have it steady. The vise, though, however, does allow me to keep as much out of the board as I want, as well as flip it around to do the back side. And so it never really touches the bench. So also another point is whenever you, if you are using a vise, just make sure that you don't close it too tightly, because then the board will start flexing, and that can also cause a lot of damage. So again, I want to just reemphasize that please solder this board before you start your Megasat board. It's very easy to damage traces on the Megasat board if you're using the wick improperly, or it's easy to get into trouble with having soldered a component down that's not put on exactly correct, and then it's really difficult to remove those parts. Okay, so whenever we take a look at this board, I just want to point out a few things. Let me find the right side up. Okay, cool. So on this board, you're going to see different numbers. And so if I'm looking here, I see it says 0805, 0603, 0402, and then another 0805, and then you've got some part areas over here for some integrated circuits. These numbers, 0805, 0603, and 0402, correspond to what we call the component footprint. And these are standard numbers, and it has to do with the dimensions of the part. So you can order 0805 resistors, and that would be a very specific footprint that you would then, the dimensions would be a certain specific footprint or dimension, and then you would need a footprint that would match that. So, so again, I would like for you to definitely try to solder as much as you can on here. The 0805 is something that you should be comfortable with. I don't believe on the Megasat board that there is an 0603, and there's definitely not an 0402, but certainly you can give it a try to be able to solder the smaller pitch parts. But definitely get very comfortable with the 0805 as well as these integrated circuits over here. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is, I'm just going to mention it, that this is a microscope that you might see in certain labs, or maybe your lab has one. And if you were to do more advanced surface mount soldering, such as those for the 0402 or even the 0603 or smaller parts, then actually soldering through the microscope is very helpful just in order to be able to do those fine pitch parts. And it takes a lot of practice to get used to that as well. So, and again, this isn't what you need for today or for this project, but I just want to point out that you might see that in some shops. So another important part is after you get the board situated, then I just want to talk about where my hands are at and what I'm doing. So I typically use either some solder rolls or even some tape, and I like to steady my hands with it. So I like to always know what my fingers are doing in relation to my wrist. And so I use these to sort of prop up my wrist. And then now I'm able to have very fine control over what is happening in my holding the iron. And then also notice that I have another finger that sort of, I kind of just brace it up against the vise, and then I'm able to have a lot of fine control over what I'm doing. And so this is really, really important to just steady your hand. Otherwise, you're kind of doing this sort of thing, and it's just very hard to hold to hold your hand steady in that case. So I definitely recommend getting something and steadying your hand, and that way you can, you know, have a lot of fine control. The other thing is the way that, the same thing that I think we taught you with the through hole, is you want to, before just kind of putting it all together, you're going to want to touch the pad and get it hot, and then you sort of come in and you add the solder. And also, compared to surface or the through hole soldering, you're only going to be putting in a very small amount of solder compared to what you were doing there. Once you start adding too much solder, then basically it'll kind of get out of control. You might have to use the wick. You might have to remove some of the solder from the pins that it's now touched across. So after you finish soldering, make sure you inspect the board manually and ensure that the pins aren't touching each other with a solder bridge. All right, and so the last point that I was going to mention on using the wick is that later on in the video, after I've kind of finished soldering some of the integrated circuits, I do go and just add a bunch of solder just in case that's something that might happen to you, and then I use the wick to be able to basically remove that solder. So definitely check that at the end of the video if you don't happen to see it. So. And also, whenever you are removing the solder with the wick, again, it's super important that you you'll see it in the video, but you put the wick down and you put the iron down, and that you whenever you remove the iron, that you also remove the wick at the same time. Don't let the wick sort of sit on there by itself without the iron, because that's whenever basically the iron is removed, so there's no heat, the wick starts cooling off, and then it starts bonding to your traces, your component, and then you pull it off, and next thing you know, you've ripped up some traces off the board because it cooled already to the wick. So that's like one of the biggest concerns, is make sure as you're removing the soldering iron that you're removing the wick with it at the same time. You want to pull those off together. Don't let it sit on there. Otherwise, you'll have pulled traces up, and it's a bad day when that happens. So in the rest of the video, you're going to see some up-close shots of me soldering the 0805, as well as one of the, and I do both resistors and capacitors, and then I show how to do one of these smaller integrated circuit, the one that says SOP-14, and then I also do a QFP44, as well as removing extra solder with the wick, and then I clean the board and I show how I brush it. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, good luck with it.